Greetings and welcome to today's webcast entitled Managed Integrated Services Now More Than Ever. Today during the webcast, we'll have three speakers. My name is Jim Metzler. I'll be the moderator, and I'm a co-founder of the Editorial Analyst Division of Webtorials. Joining me today is Steve Taylor. Steve will be the lead analyst for today's presentation, and Steve is also a co-founder of the Editorial Analyst Division of Webtorials. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks so much, Jim. Glad to be here.
And also with us today is Joel Conover from Cisco. Joel, welcome today. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks, Jim.
Now, I just want to briefly go over today's agenda. We're going to start with the analyst view presented by Steve. And Steve's going to talk about managed services today and also the linkage between that concept and the multifunction network appliances that are available today. Talk about why integrated managed services make sense, and in particular, not just make sense, but why now? And then Joel's going to give a few comments from the sponsor. So, Steve, give us, your insight into the analyst view on this very important topic.
Well, Jim, thanks so much, and Joel, thanks for joining us as well. Managed services has always been a favorite topic, and it's probably because some of us have lived the life of managed services, particularly realizing that it's always been a gray area and not an absolute. Prior to 1984, all services were essentially managed services because we had no other option. Then 1984 came along, and essentially all services became unmanaged services, and in fact there were even not only business reasons but political and regulatory reasons that the service providers were not allowed to offer what we would now define as being managed services. There are a couple of things that are really worth mentioning about this. One is that as we moved back toward managed services because of a lack of regulations, managed services really, started off as a euphemism for what we were calling here the O word, which is outsourcing, because outsourcing had such a poor early experience with so many people. So we are talking about outsourcing, but it's not outsourcing in a necessarily bad form. It's more outsourcing just from the form of letting somebody else do some of the work. The other thing I'll make a very, very quick comment about on this is the fact that with political issues, those political issues also get into political issues in terms of who controls the network. In the early days of managed services, there were some pretty good reasons that a lot of the data folks, if you want to particularly divide the world into voice folks and data folks, particularly the data folks, did not have an overly fond view of the service providers. And that was in some ways justified, and they always felt they could just get their fundamental transmission services from the service provider and add whatever they wanted onto it. As the political and regulatory environment allowed them to start offering managed services, there was resistance for two reasons. One was because of a loss of control, and the other was, very frankly, because a lot of times the service provider really didn't do a good job of understanding what it was that the industry wants. So, moving on to the next slide, we need to look at really what managed services are all about. And from my perspective, the whole key to managed services is being selective. You'll notice here that we have a blue box over on the right-hand side that talks about the WAN services and hosted services, which could certainly be managed services that exist within the network. But then we also have some various boxes that would be assumed to be on the prem. Now, in the old days, we might have very specific labels on these boxes. We might call them something like a DSU, CSU. We might call them a router. We might have an IPPBX in there, etc. Today, it can basically be anything. Again, assuming that you're going to be reading the slides, I won't mention all of the things that could be a part of the managed service, but there are an awful lot of things that could be part of a managed service today. So when we look at what these managed services are, we're going to be sharing some data with you here. This is actually an ongoing survey by the Webtorials Editorial and Analyst Division, and so this is preliminary information, but we're far enough along that the basic shapes of the curves are not going to change. And if you want to go back and look in detail at the percentages, et cetera, of course, we'll have the PDF version of the slides available for you. But basically what we're seeing is that in managed services, there's an awful lot of interest today among the user community and among the industry in general in terms of IP telephony, application hosting, managed router services, managed security, all the way down even into application delivery and managed application performance management. So that's kind of where we are today in terms of managed services. Now, I want to take a little bit of a abrupt right turn, and then we're going to bring the two back together by talking a little bit about multifunction network appliances. Lots of different names that we could be using for the multifunction network appliance, but basically what we're talking about is a device that sits at the customer premise and has lots of different functions that it could include. Once again, including router, CSU, DSU, IP, PBX, etc. And in fact, when you look at the list of options here, that list very closely mirrors an awful lot of the options that you saw 2 slides back for a managed function. So you have to start thinking, gee, what happens if we put these two together? And so that's where we get to the concept of an integrated managed service, where what we have here is selective sourcing, where you are able as an end user to go out and decide what parts of a managed service make sense for you and what parts don't make sense. So the focus here is a couple of things. First of all, it's a change in how you do your job in terms of changing from managing technology to managing the suppliers and relationships that says, hey, you know, there's some things it's just not worth my time to do. What I've got to